Access to the internet shouldn't be a luxury. It should be a right, absolutely fundamental to life in 21st century Britain. These are the words of David Cameron, announcing his government's intention to guarantee fast broadband to every home and business, and to get all of Britain online. A year earlier, Canada's then Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, introduced the Digital Canada 150 plan by saying, "We are now ready to take our place as the most technologically advanced nation on the planet," complete with, you'll notice in the bottom, an image of a steam train to illustrate this plan. But neither guarantee is ambitious. Britain's 2010 goal was to ensure that by 2015, the country had the best super fast broadband, not just ordinary fast broadband in Europe. EU targets were for very fast broadband, set in 2010. And there was also a view to eventually get to UFB, ultra-fast broadband. This is the language we face when choosing a broadband provider in Canada or in the UK. There are decisions about megabits per second and gigabytes. Download, downloads, and download speeds all have different meanings. There are limits, bundles, special offers, contracts, and speed and price choices. And then there's Ed, the sofa bear, offering us guidance on differences in broadband technologies. Ed's eye-catching comparison invokes magic to suggest that his company's cable is better than old telephone wiring, but it omits the faster and more future-proof option of fiber to the home. Copper, cable, fiber, fast, super fast, ultra fast. Does it have to be this complicated? Broadband may be as essential as gas, electricity, and water, but that's not the way we experience it today. Connecting to broadband is certainly not as simple as turning on the tap. Our everyday utilities just work. We don't need to configure anything to get electricity in all rooms of our homes. We don't need to buy different adapters when we get new appliances. And we don't need to change to a different tier of power service if we plug more things into our walls. Does anybody remember this? The information superhighway? An important feature of highways and of broadband networks is that traffic can travel at the same speed in both directions. If broadband really is like roads, water, and electricity, as politicians tell us, let's look at ways it could be better. Fed up with waiting for decent broadband, community members in rural Lancashire took matters into their own hands. Volunteers learned how to use machines like this one to blow fiber right to their homes. More than 1,500 customers now use one of the fastest and most reliable networks anywhere for just £30 a month. In a few cities in the US, Google is attempting to disrupt the broadband market with its Google Fiber service. The only choice that Google Fiber customers have to make is whether to add on a TV subscription or not. Its service, an order of magnitude faster than the competition, costs $70 a month. In Australia and Singapore, among other countries, governments restructured their telecommunications markets to facilitate the transition to fiber broadband, planning national broadband networks and encouraging new companies to offer services. Unfortunately, Australia has since become an example of how not to do this. Communities, businesses like Google, and some governments are leading a move away from copper and cable broadband to optical fiber networks. These networks can offer symmetrical gigabit service, but I'd guess for the people who live in these connected homes, what's most important is that their broadband just works. So what's happening in Canada and in the UK? For most of us, this simple, reliable, affordable, very high quality broadband is just not available. Next generation broadband, combining the benefits of fiber with customer-friendly business models, requires companies like BT on the left and Bell to do things differently. Rather than rapidly rolling out fiber, which is likely to meet our need for decades, many existing providers are said to be squeezing every last bit of functionality out of their old networks. This may benefit shareholders, but leaves customers in the slow lane. Taking broadband as an example allows us to think about the roles researchers can play in addressing complex issues in our society. What are the points of engagement for academics? We might begin by identifying discussions to participate in, as I'm doing here by presenting research to the Canadian Telecommunications Regulator. Researchers can inform policymakers by clearly articulating the differences among stakeholder groups' positions on issues, something I'm working on with this draft infographic. We can reveal power dynamics and call out attempts to influence policy directions. And we can challenge dominant perspectives and offer alternative approaches. Such efforts should, of course, be informed by reliable and comprehensive data. The Canadian Media Concentration Research Project, led by Professor Dwayne Winsek at Carleton University in Ottawa, offers an excellent example of data providing insights on the structure of telecommunications markets in Canada. Academics can work with communities to celebrate and share their achievements and make their knowledge accessible to policymakers. The First Mile Project is an outstanding example of a long-term collaboration between First Nations communities and scholars to develop community-centric technology solutions and to help policymakers understand the unique needs of Canada's First Nations. The Regional and Rural Broadband Project focuses on developing better models to assess the impact of broadband use in rural Ontario and applying improved models and metrics to quantify the return on investment when the public sector funds the construction of broadband networks. In the case of broadband, we can even pitch in and help build the network. But sticking with our familiar tools, academics can collect data, develop analytical models, articulate alternative approaches, identify and challenge dominant perspectives, and celebrate successes by sharing stories with policymakers. Thank you.
So often when there's opportunity for government investment, they've got a choice between trying to increase the speed of people who've already got broadband or trying to roll out much slower broadband but to places that are further away from population centres. Do you know anything about the trade-offs that governments make in different countries and what you think is sensible?
So the figures that I showed at the beginning were an example of that. So those were actually projects that were about extending broadband to the people who didn't have broadband. So often the decision is that you'll leave most of the rollout to the market, and the assumption is that you don't have to invest in that as long as there's a business case. Commercial services will come along and do that, and then the rest will be picked up by the government type funded services. I think the advantage in some of these approaches that are trying to shake up the markets is that it changes the business model as well. So one of the points I was trying to make is that it's not just about the speed, it's actually about the ability for your broadband service to be much more like a utility, so that it's really simple to use. You step away from all those words on the Wordle thing, that you're not nearly as constrained. And to get that fundamental change in business model, it seems like the markets have to be disrupted a little bit from their existing state.
With this at the University of Edinburgh, because I think the internet for the Highlands is actually routed through the informatics building due to these sorts of problems, because we kind of turned into this interesting point where the government would fund research even if they weren't going to fund getting internet to random people. And so we're doing lots of research on how to go and set up these sorts of networks, and then that research is being duplicated by a lot of other communities in the region. And so this is more of a comment, I guess, than a really strong question, but I do wonder how much we're seeing that sort of thing elsewhere, because the focus there is very much technical. How do you actually set up this sort of network? The Highlands are fascinating from lots of perspectives. It's easier to bolt something to a tree than it is to necessarily put up a pole like you're supposed to. And so we're seeing a lot of this ground-up engineering and the outcome of that, and how transferable that is perhaps to other areas. It seems to be transferable to other areas of the Highlands, but I don't know about places like Canada.
Well, it does mean that the context really influences how things roll out. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Time's ticking away.
I'm just making a comment in here about you're saying internet connection should be like utilities. You may want to think about in a deregulated markets like Alberta or UK. The utilities are quite complicated as well. They come up with 25 different plans and pricing and so on and so forth. So it's just a sort of a comment that maybe utilities and gas and electricity are not the best
Yeah, the metaphor
example to sort of do that.
isn't perfect, but I think we all know what we should expect to happen when we turn on our tap.